Hi everyone, and welcome to the Puget Sound Navy Museum's Military Genealogy webinar. My name is Megan Churchwell, and I'm the curator here at the museum, and I'll be your host for today. You're probably here because you agree with me that military history really is our history. Now, a lot of service members didn't talk about their own wartime experiences, so even immediate family may not have known much about their service. And I hope today that I can shed some light on how to find records that will uncover that important history. Like many of you, my own genealogy searches began with my own family tree. My first foray into genealogy specific to the Navy Museum was this trunk that you see here. Now, it had been in our collection since the 1990s, and as you can see, it had the initials and rate and rank painted on, but no other information. And through genealogy research, I was able to find out that the owner was a Pearl Harbor survivor with a long Navy career. Kenneth Merle Salmon was born in 1922 in Iowa and enlisted in the Navy just after he turned 18. He was on the battleship USS Maryland during the attack on Pearl Harbor and later served on minesweepers, staying in the Navy all the way up until 1960. He retired here in Bremerton, where he lived until 2006. Now, this is just a taste of the information you can find with the techniques I'll be covering today. So before we dive in, I just want to point out that this talk will cover a number of helpful links, and for a full list of those, please visit our website. The address is on the screen. And also, please use the comment box below this video. I'll be responding to any questions that you post in response to today's talk. So with that said, let's dive in. Here are some of the things that we'll be covering today. All branches of the U.S. military with a focus on the U.S. Navy. All periods from colonial service all the way up until modern day. We'll be covering what records are available and where they can be located, including military personnel files, various records that are specific to a particular war or time period, and then going beyond the individual records to unit records, deck logs, muster rolls, and lots of other records available from the National Archives, and then some important non-federal sources for military records. So as you can see, it's a bit of a whirlwind tour, so thanks for joining me on it. So where do you even begin this research? Well, you'll want to start by determining which ancestors may have served. Maybe you have a family story or a photo of a man in uniform, a line in an obituary, or a scrap of paperwork or a newspaper clipping. All these things might lead you to begin your search. Now, your research path will depend on what military branch they served in and during what era. Regardless of their service specifics, I always encourage you to request multiple records if they're available. They might have different information included in them. Sometimes transcription or filing errors can mean that some records can't be located while others can. Note that military records provide more than just information on their service. You might find birth dates, death dates, the place where they lived when they were 18 or when they enlisted, the names of close family members. All of those things might be found in military records. And most military records are accessed in the U.S. through the National Archives, or NARA. That's where records created by the federal government go for permanent storage. And since the military is, of course, part of the federal government, military records go to NARA. And what this means for you is that the first step for most military record searches will be with a form called the SF-180. Briefly, it looks like the form there on your screen, the request pertaining to military records. It's available on the National Archives website, and there's a direct link to it in the handout that I mentioned just a minute ago. Now, when is it appropriate to submit the SF-180? Well, this is for military service that ended during World War I to 1957 for all branches of the military. It's also for 1885 to World War I for the U.S. Navy, and it's also for more recent records, those with service ending after 1957, if you are the veteran or their next of kin. So what information do you need to submit the request? Well, you at least need a name, service number, and dates of service help. They're really just to help the National Archives staff narrow down to find exactly the file you're looking for. Now, who can submit this request? Well, if it's been 62 years since the end of their service, that means they left the military in 1958 or earlier, anyone can submit this request. They're considered archival, so they're open to the public. The more recent service, that ending after 1958, does need to be requested by the veteran or next of kin. Now, this request is always sent to the National Archives. There are a couple different branches within the archives that handle these requests, but thankfully there's a handy chart on page 2 of the form that breaks down where to send that request depending on the service particulars. It can take several months to receive a response. Of course, with COVID-19 currently going on, I know that responding to requests is paused for now, but hopefully it'll be back up soon. And what can you expect to receive back after you place this request? Well, this file varies quite a bit. Sometimes it's just a couple pages. Sometimes it's literally a big binder worth of loose pages all about your service member. Now, as I mentioned, that SF-180 is mainly for 20th century service. What about going back a bit further in time? Well, further back, the personnel file is known as a compiled military service record. These records are also held by the National Archives, but there's a different form to request them. It's known as the NATF 86 form, and it's available online, and again, there's a link in the handouts page. Now, this form is for Army only, so not the Navy or the Marines. And in order to request these records, you must know the veteran's name, the state where they enlisted, their service dates, and whether they were part of the volunteer or regular Army. But because of the age of the records, you don't need to prove that you're the next of kin. Anyone can place this request. So an important difference between the records you get through the SF-180 and those earlier records is that compiled military service records are assembled after the fact, rather than kept in real time for each soldier or sailor. So when you request the earlier records with the NATF 86, you'll get a form that looks like the one in the image here. It's assembled after the fact from things like muster rolls and pay vouchers and other records. It usually includes the service member's rank, unit, date mustered in and out of service, basic biographical information, sometimes medical information might be included, as well as important facts of their military service. So the NATF 86 was for early Army records, but what about the other branches of the military? Now, as I mentioned earlier, for 1885 or later, you're going to use the SF-180 to request Navy records. But for pre-1885, unfortunately, there's no single equivalent to that compiled service record. But thankfully, there are lots of alternatives to help you reconstruct your ancestors' service history. For instance, there are lists of officers and enlisted sailors that have been published in books. There are yearly publication registers of the commissioned officers of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. There's lots on microfilm from the National Archives, like abstracts of service records of naval officers. If they happen to attend the Naval Academy, there are, of course, records for each of the cadets who attended there. There are also correspondence files containing letters related to enlisted men who served in the Navy. So again, this is just a taste of some of the records that the National Archives has on those early sailors. Now, unfortunately, those early Navy records aren't the only ones that will have to be reconstructed a bit. There's a big caveat to some National Archives records requests. Your ancestors' personnel file may not be available, mainly because of a big fire that happened back in 1973. And it unfortunately destroyed 18 million personnel files, mostly Army personnel who served between 1912 and 1960. Also, some Air Force personnel records for service from 1947 to 64, with names that are after the last name of Hubbard. The good news is that Navy and Marine Corps records were not affected by this fire. So what can you do if you think your ancestors' file was affected by this fire? Well, request anyways. It's been almost 50 years since the fire, and since then, National Archives staff have been hard at work reconstructing the files that were burned using things like VA claims, state records, pay vouchers, medical records, etc. And even some of the burned files might still have useful information in them. So it's worth requesting them, even if you think your relatives' files were lost in the fire. All right, so that covers the individual personnel records. Next, we'll be going through records by era that might shed some additional light on your ancestors' military service. Now, for these, we'll be going roughly from the colonial era to the present, though, of course, there are lots of record types that will overlap several eras. Now, starting with colonial and revolutionary records, there actually aren't that many records still available. There weren't a lot of personnel records kept in the first place, as you might imagine in those chaotic early years. And then there were major fires in 1800 and 1814, and other natural disasters over time have unfortunately led to the loss of many records. But there are some compiled service records and muster rolls that still exist, and they are all held by the National Archives. There's a finding aid available, and you'll find that in that helpful links sheet that is on our website. Next, the census can be an important source for both the War of 1812 and Civil War era veterans. So in 1840 and 1890, the census included questions pertaining to veterans. Now, I know a lot of you might be pretty familiar with working with the census and know that most of the 1890 census was lost, but the military veterans schedule for that year actually did survive. So the 1840 has been compiled and published as a census of pensioners for revolutionary or military services. You can find that online and in lots of libraries around the country. The 1890 is available for most states, mostly in the second half of the alphabet has survived. These records have the service member's name, rank, company, regiment, or vessel, dates of enlistment and discharge, length of service, residence, disability, and assorted remarks. And they are available on microfilm from the National Archives. Another source when you're dealing mostly with 19th century service is the pension file. So these contain pension applications as well as records of payments for veterans and their widows and heirs. The pension was granted for military service between 1775 and 1916. So basically everything all the way up until World War I. These records often contain some very interesting supporting documents, like narratives of service, often written by the service member themselves, marriage certificates, birth records, death certificates, all things that you might use to prove that you are deserving of the pension payment, family letters, depositions of witnesses, discharge papers, all sorts of things. And you can order these pension files from the National Archives online or by mail using a form known as the NATF Form 85. And again, that's available online, and there's a link in the link sheet that I've provided on the website. And very similar to the pension file is the bounty land warrant. So this is for service between 1775 and 1855. So basically everything up to but not including the Civil War. This was an award of land in exchange for their wartime service. Now, an important caveat to note here is that it doesn't actually mean that the soldier lived on the land they were given. Most of them sold their warrants because they had no use for this land, some of which was fairly remote. And most Revolutionary War and War of 1812 bounty land warrant records have been combined with their pension files. So you can order them both at the same time using that NATF Form 85. So while the bounty land warrant program stopped before Civil War service, there are lots of other records that pertain specifically to the Civil War. And one I particularly like is the Soldiers and Sailors database. It includes all the Army soldiers on both sides, as well as African American sailors who served in the Union Navy. Also, lots of information about regiment histories, prisoner lists, battle narratives, cemeteries, and more. It's really a good source for putting a relative's service into context. Moving on to World War I, draft registration cards are a great source. The information on them includes name, home address, birth date, race, citizenship, occupation, and employer's name, nearest relative and address, and physical description. So as you can see, goes way beyond just their military service. And in fact, they contain no information about an individual's military service itself. Some who have a card did not end up serving in the war, and some who served enlisted without filling out one of these cards. But in general, they are for men between the ages of 18 to 45, so specifically born from September of 1872 to September of 1900. There are 24 million of them. They can be found at the National Archives, including on microfilm at all the archives branches. They're also searchable on most major genealogy sites like Ancestry.com. They're pretty widely available on the internet. And the card that you see here is actually Babe Ruth's draft registration card. Similarly, for World War II, the enlistment records are a good starting point. They include all who enlisted in any branch of the military from 1938 to 1946, and they can be searched online via the National Archives AAD. And again, there's a link to that in the links page available on our website. And on each of these cards, you'll find the name, residence, date of enlistment, rank, branch, race and citizenship information, education level, and their civilian occupation. So how about service after World War II? Well, many of these more recent records aren't available just yet because of privacy laws. Military personnel records become public 62 years after the service member's discharge. This means that the records of many Korean War veterans are available, but not yet the Vietnam War era records. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Things from recent wars, like casualty lists and burial records, have already become public. Note that these records going public depends on the discharge date. So the sailor in this photo served in Korea, but he actually remained in the Navy until the late 1950s, so his records aren't yet available to the public. However, they can be requested by him or his next of kin. Non-archival records can be requested by the veteran themselves or the next of kin. Most service members are seeking the DD-214, which is their discharge certificate. And this can be requested online through a service known as eVetRex, again offered by the National Archives. So you've requested all these files. What might you find in them? Well, they might be hard to follow. The photocopying can be a bit questionable. And there are going to be plenty of acronyms, place names, often terms that only mean something within the military. But within them you can find enlistment place and date, duty stations and assignments, training, qualifications, performance ratings, awards and medals earned, disciplinary actions, administrative correspondence, paperwork related to their discharge or retirement, information on their participation in various war campaigns, all sorts of information. Now, there are lots of websites that can help you decipher all this. Sometimes if you just Google the acronym, it'll come right up. I've included a few helpful links on the link sheet, and you're always welcome to shoot me a message if you're having trouble deciphering any kind of Navy record. So moving on, next we'll be taking a look at some of the other records to look for, beyond what the National Archives keeps on individual soldiers and sailors. So once you have the soldier's personnel record, naturally you'll want to know more about his experience while in uniform. The military, fortunately, keeps plenty of records to help you do just that. There are battle reports, muster rolls, regiment and company histories, and other records that still exist for all eras of service. And these records can help tell the full story of your ancestors' experiences while in service. In particular, they help you understand not just where he went, but what he did there. For service in the Navy, a great source is the deck log. This provides a day-by-day account for the ship. Major activities, events that happened, the weather while they were at sea. It always lists the officers on board, as well as enlisted sailors when they were involved in notable events. So these are, again, a daily log that must be kept. And the National Archives has them for the years of 1801 to 1983. So a pretty long span. And for access to these, you would contact the National Archives at College Park with the email link that's on your screen right now. Some of them have even been digitized and are available online. Now, after 1983, they're not yet considered archival quite yet, and they're kept by the Naval History and Heritage Command, or NHHC, which is based in Washington, D.C. Another favorite of mine is the muster roll. All branches of service have something like this. Sometimes they're called payrolls or rosters, depending on the era or branch. And it includes the name of the ship or the shore station, the names of all those present, their periods of service, transfers and discharges. Sometimes it has really surprising details, things like birthplace or the name of the ship they were on before they transferred to this one where their muster roll was taken. In order to find it, you'll need to know where, either the physical location or the ship name, your ancestor was stationed on. They're arranged alphabetically by the name of the ship or station, and then by date. They're all held by the National Archives. A lot of them have actually been microfilmed, so they are available at your local branch of the National Archives. This is just the tip of the iceberg of records available. Other military-related records include military medical records, veterans' headstone applications, the Veterans Affairs Burrell's death file. Sometimes you might actually find that an ancestor you thought was in the military actually served in a civilian capacity. They worked for a military branch, but they weren't in uniform. We run into that a lot at the Puget Sound Navy Museum because we're next to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. So those are, of course, federal employees, but they haven't enlisted in the Navy. So I just wanted to briefly touch on how to get those records. They are available from the National Archives. The official personnel folder, or OPF, can be accessed from 1850 to 1951 by anybody. You don't have to be the employee or the next of kin. Now, the newer records, much like the enlisted counterparts, are non-archival, so they're not available to the public. But those older ones are available by request from the National Archives. So most of those, of course, are all located in Washington, D.C., but we also have a branch of the National Archives in Seattle, and there are a few others across the country. So most of the federal military records are held either in D.C. or at the National Military Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. But the local branches have lots of other records. They have local records. For instance, the branch at Seattle has Puget Sound Navy Yard, local Coast Guard, and other local military sites across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And each of the local branches also has microfilm of commonly accessed records like the census, pension and bounty land warrant applications, lots of other useful records. Now, of course, COVID-19 has forced its temporary closure to researchers, but it's a valuable resource, and I encourage you to check it out as soon as they're back open. Okay, so far all the records we've discussed are from the National Archives. Makes sense since the military is federal and they hold all the federal government records. But there are plenty of other places to check. I want to start with the Naval History and Heritage Command. Now, other branches of the military have similar services. So while this is for the Navy, there's also the U.S. Army Center of Military History, for instance. Now, NHHC has things related to the Navy, including war diaries, manuscripts, biographies, photos of ships, cruise books, which are like a yearbook for a ship's crew. And they also manage DANFS, which is Histories of Navy Ships. Moving to the local level, the Washington State Archives, and of course other states have their equivalent, has records created by the state, so not the federal government, but the state government, including records from state veterans' homes, like Retzel over in Port Orchard. They also have records for the National Guard here in the state of Washington, especially records from World War I and World War II. And they also have applications submitted by the state's veterans of both World Wars for a state bonus. And this wasn't something that happened in every state, but it did happen in most of them So I encourage you to check with your state archives if you're researching a veteran of one of the world wars. And there are even more local resources for military records. You might want to check with the local American Legion or the VFW or other veterans groups your ancestor may have belonged to. Specifically to World War I, many counties created honor rolls, which were a plaque or a published book with the names and sometimes brief biographies or photos of local veterans who served. Specifically with World War II, check with the county clerk. This might seem like a bit of an odd resource, but actually at the end of the war, every service member got a copy of their discharge papers. The Army actually recommended that they file a copy with the local county clerk so that if the veteran's personal copy got lost, there would be one available there. And some counties even gave tax breaks or other benefits to those who filed it with them. And for a lot of veterans whose records were lost in that fire in the 1970s, this might be the only record remaining of their discharge papers. Now, all of these were different levels of government resources, but there are lots of other places to check. There's the LDS Family History Library, which has a free online search at familysearch.org. The National Archives has digitization agreements with sites including Fold3 and Ancestry.com. Now, while these are paid sites, during COVID-19, many public libraries have opened up at-home access to them for their members, so you might want to check if your public library has done that. Fold3 and Ancestry.com have many searchable resources, like correspondence between naval officers, that otherwise you may not have known even exist for your relative. Now, all the records that Ancestry.com has digitized for the National Archives are accessible for free at all National Archives research rooms, including in the Seattle branch. And finally, there's the uniform itself. If you have uniform pieces or medals or maybe a photo of your ancestor in uniform, that can provide valuable information itself. There are lots of books out there to help you ID what you're looking at. I know it can be a bit confusing for those who haven't served. And of course, you can reach out to me for identifying these items or for advice about how to care for them properly. But some of the things you might be able to tell from the uniform itself might be their service number. Sometimes their blood type is on the dog tags. Of course, you've also got patches that can tell you things like their rank and their rating and what awards they may have earned, which would tell you what battles they were in, for instance. So a lot can be gleaned from the uniform itself. Now, where can you go for further help with military genealogy? Well, all of the National Archives branches are, of course, a great source. I know the one in Seattle hosts brick wall genealogy events specifically to help you with your genealogy research. Your local library is, of course, another great one. Many offer free access to Ancestry.com resources, and some also have genealogy centers. The National Archives also has an online service called History Hub, where anyone can post a question on a discussion forum